March 1944. Berlin inside, the cipher rooms of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. As winter bled into spring, and the city's radio direction-finding nets hummed beneath the air raid sirens, German signals officers assessed a tactical voice system from the other side of the world and reached a hard operational conclusion. Whatever the Americans had built on top of the Navajo language for their Marine units in the Pacific, it was not something German cryptanalytic methods could prise open in timeframes that mattered to war. The desks were the same as ever maps, pinned with colored flags for Allied fleets in the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific, liaison folders for Japanese naval intelligence, digests from the BM Dents and the Army's General der Nachrichtenlieferung, cross-briefs from the Luftwaffe's listening posts, and the vocabulary of the room had its own rhythm. Collection, classification, traffic analysis, hypotheses, refutation, operational impact. What had changed by March 1944 was the weight of probabilities. Across months of fragments and reports, some gleaned from Japanese partners, some inferred from Allied after-action material, and captured instructions German specialists had come to accept that the Marines' Indian Nerfunk, as some called it in shorthand, was functionally out of reach for their toolset. It was not a matter of finding the right grill or a clever crib. It was a matter of the problem itself, a living language with few competent non-native listeners inside the axis, wrapped around a disciplined, continuously refreshed code vocabulary, deployed at exactly the echelon where time was the commodity that broke every cryptanalytic dream frontline minutes. What they could say with confidence in Berlin in March 1944 was bounded by the physics of the war. Germany did not possess organic, theater-wide intercept coverage of U.S. Marine tactical voice circuits in the Central Pacific. It did not float a chain of listening trawlers between the Gilberts and the Marshalls. It could not point an Army listening regiment at a beach radio during a contested landing half a world away. German analysts therefore lived by indirection. The BDNist was good famously so in the Atlantic against merchant convoys earlier in the conflict. The Army's cryptanalytic arm had chalked its own quiet victories against Soviet and other systems. But that excellence existed within a European-centered sensorium. Pacific tactical voice traffic reached Berlin, when it reached at all, through liaison with the Japanese and through Allied documents captured in Europe, sometimes washed up months later with the tide of a campaign. That created an asymmetry in time, and time is everything in signals. Even a perfect method would have to fight the calendar. Even a breakthrough yesterday would arrive too late to stop a landing this morning on a coral atoll the size of a small town. The method did not exist. That was the second, deeper layer of the March assessment. The voice system the Marines used rooted in Navajo, as its spoken matrix and augmented by a table of agreed terms and a phonetic rendering scheme for names and numbers, was deliberately built against the weaknesses that German cryptanalysts exploited everywhere else. At its heart, the German art preferred structure, repeated keys, predictable phraseology, machine or hand cipher systems with human fatigue baked in, traffic volumes sufficient to find statistically useful regularities. Here, by contrast, the signal was a human voice, carrying a language with morphological structures and idioms unfamiliar to trained European linguists, spoken at conversational speed by young men trained to stay concise, whose unit-level code tables were refreshed and expanded as operations evolved. You could not order attack it the way you attacked a rotor machine. You could not run long-term depth across a fleet circuit and wait for a sloppy weather preface. Plain language, but not plain. One German notemaker wrote that winter in a line that survived in a liaison abstract. And that was the operational truth. They heard that the Marines were not just speaking Navajo. They were speaking an engineered Navajo, tailored to war, with substitutions that mapped living images to weapons and units in ways that were obvious to the trained insider and slippery to the outsider, who might, with luck, identify the language family but still miss the meaning. Japanese analysts had faced the same wall, and German officers in Berlin knew it from liaison summaries. The Japanese had the collection, for they were the enemy the code talkers were built to deny. They had proximity to the battles and a technical culture capable of excellent cryptology. If Tokyo's specialists could not break the system with front-row seats, Berlin had no realistic path from a distant balcony. This was not an idle inference. It was one of those rare cases in which coalition intelligence made humility unavoidable. German files in early 1944 recorded the American habit of pairing a Navajo-trained operator with a second Marine who could assist in transcribing or relaying the message. And they recorded the tactical tempo, brief exchanges to call for fire, to redirect a platoon left, to shift a company net 200 meters to the palm line, to report a bunker, alive or dead. They understood the signature of a system designed around latency, where the British had taught the world with Ultra that one could surprise an enemy at theater scale by reading his machines. The Americans in the Pacific were teaching a parallel lesson about speed at the beachhead. If a message that might save a squad's life travels in a handful of seconds because no encipherment and decipherment are required because the cryptology is in the tongue that frames the words, then any attacker who cannot comprehend the tongue is beaten not just in accuracy but in time. German officers were trained to measure advantage by hours and days. At Tarawa and Quailine, the relevant yardstick had been minutes. In March 1944, that truth had hardened into doctrine in Berlin. Even if comprehension were technically possible, the comprehension had to happen now, not tomorrow, and now was not available. Berlin's historians of the war would later on romanticize or simplify that conclusion. But the men at the desks were precise. They did not call the system unbreakable in the metaphysical sense. They called it unbreakable on the battlefield at its point of use. A native-speaking linguist with the right training, a clean audio intercept, time to hypothesize the mapping between chosen words and military reference, and some luck in capturing a unit's evolving vocabulary. Perhaps such a combination could produce partial comprehension after months, even years, in a laboratory environment. That was a sterile victory. It had no capacity to kill a bunker in the hour it needed killing. Against their own standards of operational utility, the German answer in March 1944 was straightforward. It would cost more time than they had to make sense of what the Marines were saying, and while they worked. The Marines would be gone, the net silent, the beach taken. Unbreakable, in that room, was a word about calendars, not absolutes. To see how they got there, one has to pull the camera back to the culture of German signals in 1943 and early 1944. The Bedienst's proud record against Allied naval codes before 1943 had built a mystique. It had also, subtly, built a bias. Success against a systematic adversary seduces the mind into expecting regularity. The Army's cryptanalytic tradition grown, through years of work against Soviet systems and other European targets, shared the bias. Find structure, harvest repetition, attack the human habits in the system. The Luftwaffe's contribution was shaped by its own operational priorities, often focused on radio telephony and radar countermeasures over the continent. In each case, the Axis experience that made German analysts formidable in Europe trained them to listen for the wrong shapes in the Pacific. A Marine on a coral spit did not speak in liturgy. He spoke to survive. He did not broadcast paragraphs that a pencil could break into letters. He spoke a handful of words to a fellow Marine with the same lexicon, and the exchange ended before anyone east of the Urals could spin up a method. Beyond that, there was the language. German universities had scholars of Native American cultures in the pre-war era, but they did not mass-produce fluent Navajo linguists, and certainly not ones who could be stuffed into an intercept hut and told to transcribe a fading, static-laced voice transmission, while a staff officer counted seconds, where German cryptology approached a technical contest. This was a human one, and the Germans did not field the humans who could win it. From Berlin's perspective, the empirical evidence arriving by early 1944 framed the question. The Americans had used the system in the Solomons and the Gilberts. They had introduced it in 1942 with a small cadre and had, by 1943, expanded the program to hundreds of trained speakers embedded in infantry, artillery, and headquarters elements of the Marine divisions. That expansion itself carried a signature that German analysts recognized. The Americans would not scale a brittle solution. They scaled this one. German officers, collating reports from Quailine in February and from Iniwort later that month, saw a familiar pattern in Allied after-action material. When the tempo rose and the terrain tightened, voice nets that mattered most became the ones the Americans protected with their living code. Across those islands, the Marines called shells onto targets with a speed that white light, Morse wrapped in classical ciphers, could not match. You could hear the doctrine evolving, on open water and at higher echelons. American fleet circuits leaned on machines and on professional cryptographic procedures. On a beach, a battalion net leaned on a language that very few people on Earth could understand, unless they had been born to it and trained to its war vocabulary. In that setting, German analysts carved the problem the way they would any target. Identify the consistent elements, separate the stable from the variable, search for pivots. In a machine cipher, a pivot could be a keying error or a stereotyped preamble. In a manual cipher, it could be a slur of arithmetic or the use of a captured indicator. In this voice system, the stable element was the deep structure of Navajo itself, the phonology, the morphology, the logic of how words composed meaning. The variable was the Marines' evolving codebook, the mapping from images and nouns to tactical reference, the procedures for spelling out proper names with a phonetic alphabet of everyday objects, the habit of refreshing terms to complicate enemy traffic analysis. The Germans could imagine extracting the stable element. With enough recordings, a linguist could, in principle, identify the language family and begin to annotate sounds against meanings. But that only got you to the instrument. It did not hand you the melody. Without the codebook, you still had to guess whether the object that means turtle today meant a tank or a transport craft or a time interval. To acquire that mapping, you needed side information, captured paper, a prisoner, or a pattern of correlation between observed words and observed actions. In Europe, German analysts built those correlations with long-haul traffic, large data volumes, and a sky full of reconnaissance planes. In the Pacific tactical fight, the short bursts and the battle chaos starved the correlation engine, and the Germans had no reconnaissance of their own at the scene to ground the guesses. The mapping stayed a private language game inside a Marine battalion, and without it, the German attack died in the doorway. Berlin's professionals were not naive about the tricks of voice. They understood voice print analysis in its primitive, wartime form. They understood that even plain language radio telephony could be attacked by traffic analysis: who talks to whom, when, for how long, on what frequencies. They could, and did, apply that to the Pacific insofar as their Japanese counterparts shared data. But traffic analysis served operational prediction only if linked to comprehension at the point of decision. If you knew that a certain net's cadence predicted an artillery shoot, but you did not know which target the artillery would hit, you could not move a reserve on a tiny island with enough precision to matter. German memoranda in the spring, therefore, changed their tone. They treated the Marines' Navajo system not as an intellectual insult to cryptology, but as a problem of levels. Strategic cryptology wanted to read a leader's mail. Operational cryptology wanted to steer ships and divisions. Tactical cryptology wanted to change a firefight. The Marines had solved their level with a tool built for the human throat, and a lexicon that shifted as needed. That tool took tactical cryptology away from the enemy by making the minimum unit of comprehension a person the enemy did not have. One might ask whether German persistence could have found a wedge if the war had lasted longer, or if some quirk of collection had gifted Berlin a deep archive of recordings. In March 1944, the men at OKW's Cipher Bureau did not waste words on such counterfactuals. They counted ships, fuel, and above. All time, the Allies would soon invade France. The Luftwaffe needed every engineer. The Kriegsmarine needed every technician. The army needed every mathematician who could win a day against a Soviet field cipher or reduce a British staff system to order. Devoting a scarce, highly trained linguist to the hope of half-comprehending a Marine battalion's voice net after months of work was a luxury Germany could not afford. Even if you believed you might get somewhere, you could not afford the journey, and you could not eat the meal when you arrived. As spring dawned over Berlin through a layer of smoke and dust, that ruthless arithmetic governed every desk. The Marines on the receiving end of those calculations did not know and did not care about Berlin's feelings. They cared that a Navajo voice could call a fire mission faster than a cipher clerk could prepare and strip a message. They cared that an enemy who had surprised the Royal Navy in the Atlantic with radio intelligence could do nothing to prevent a platoon from wheeling left into a grove of palms because a boy from Arizona had spoken 3 words to a net no one else could pass. They cared, finally, that secrecy in war had many forms, and that one of them was born from a language history the globe had overlooked. German officers, who had spent years exploiting the predictability of men with typewriters and wheels, could recognize the irony. What made the Marines system work was not the absence of error, but the absence of a common world. Without that world, the childhood stories, the idioms, the learned metaphors, the outsider heard music without a key. So March 1944, in Berlin, did not produce a trumpet blast, judgment, but a quiet operational verdict posted to the inside of the mind. This problem is not for us, not now. The war's physics said so, the coalition's liaison said so, and the math of seconds said so. Under the lamps of the cipher rooms, the German officers who had made their careers on finding purchase in human systems finally faced one that refused to bulge on the timescale of battle. And if there was any professional pride left in that reality, it lay in the honesty of the assessment. They did not mask failure in metaphysics. They spoke in the language their trade respected most: cost versus effect, time versus gain. Against that ledger, the Marines Navajo system wrote, in black ink. Around that same month, across a world of water and sand, the Pacific War kept driving the Americans forward into the Marshalls, and toward the Marianas, and the radio nets that mattered most kept carrying syllables that meant life and death to the men who understood them, and static to the men who did not. German analysts knew the names of those islands from their maps. They could draw the isobars around a naval task force and speculate where it might anchor. They could read the battleship dispatches that survived in Allied communiques. But when the question narrowed down to the 5 seconds in which a Marine called for smoke on the left edge of a field or asked for a bearing to a yellow panel in the surf, Berlin's expertise dissolved at its limits. In March 1944, with the air raid sirens beginning their season of constancy and the last winter coats being folded into cupboards across the city, that was the conclusion written into German practice. If a thing cannot be done in time to change the field, then, in the only sense that matters to war, it cannot be done. The Marines had found a way to make an enemy who loved systems work in vain. They had learned to respect the Pacific the hard way, by watching their Japanese partners fail to turn intercepts into decisions fast enough to matter, and by reading the American habit of solving problems with a simple tool that refused to be simple. From Berlin, the sequence made sense. In the Silbuts at Tarawa, in November 1943, the tempo of landings and counterattacks created an environment in which any encipherment that required time was a tax on survival, and the Americans seemed determined to stop paying that tax. In January and February 1944, across the Marshalls at Quayaline, and then Inniwalk, reports that trickled back to Europe through Allied documents and press accounts sketched the same pattern. Marine battalions operating on tight island terrain, combined arms fire that hinged on minute-by-minute observation and correction, and platoon nets that stayed short, local, and ruthless in their informational discipline. For a European cryptanalytic culture trained to love depth and volume, this was starvation. Berlin's officers could count intercepted messages across a U-boat campaign by the thousands. Here, the war lived in handfuls, and the handfuls were spoken in a language no German analyst could transcribe at speed. The conclusion that had solidified by March 1944 was not built on romance about indigenous secrecy. It was built on the physics of a battlefield, where a human voice in a rare tongue beat any machine that required. Even a small ritual before meaning emerged. What Berlin could reconstruct of the system sharpened that view. The Marines' implementation had 2 intertwined parts. First, there was the substrate, a natural language with phonology, syntax, and idiom that were not part of the training of Axis linguists, and were not widely represented in academic departments that could be diverted to war work. Second, there was the overlay, a controlled vocabulary and a phonetic scheme that the Marines had turned into a fast, compact way to carry names, coordinates, and concepts. If you were inside that overlay-trained current, and paired with a partner who could check and relay you, did not need a cipher machine to protect your message from outsiders. Your throat was the machine, and the protection was the absence of a shared world with the listener. If, like Berlin, you were outside the overlay, you were locked into a two-front fight. You had to build basic comprehension of the language from noisy voice intercepts. And you had to infer the unit's evolving mapping from common nouns or images to tactical meanings. Berlin's analysts were honest about what that meant. Without an improbable stroke of luck captured codebook, a prisoner willing and able to decode the unit's current terms, or a deep high-fidelity corpus of recordings tethered to detailed ground, truth the second fight would not be won fast enough to change a landing or a firefight. The picture that emerged by March 1944 was therefore not a shrug of helplessness, but a disciplined triage. The problem could be interesting to a scholar. It was not useful to a staff officer responsible for combat power this week. That triage acquired teeth when the Germans compared it to cases that had made their reputation. Against Allied naval systems earlier in the war, the obedience had prospered by living inside the enemy's rhythm. They found order where order existed, convoy codes and their indicators, predictable formats, and a sea of traffic that let probability do the heavy lifting. Against Soviet systems, Army cryptologists had harvested the brutal constraints of frontline cipher clerks, under pressure, and had walked through cracks opened by human error. In each success story, the material conditions of the target offered something to grip, and the Germans had the hands to grip it. The Marines system offered nothing in the same shape. There was no key to steal, because there was no key. There was no indicator to misuse, because there was no indicator. There was no preamble to count on, because the voice habit on those nets was the opposite of liturgical. It is harder to break a ritual that is not there. By March 1944, German memoranda began to speak in that pragmatic tone. Do not chase ghosts. Put the scarce mathematicians on the enemy systems that still pay rent when they yield. And let go of the puzzles that reward you only with an abstract understanding that arrives long after the beach is quiet. The German conversation did not occur in a cultural vacuum. The question of whether indigenous languages could serve as military shields had a prehistory in both world wars. Americans had experimented with native languages in World War I. So had other powers, with varying scales and seriousness. What changed in the Pacific in 1942 to 1944 was not the novelty of the idea, but the operationalization of it. The Marines program did not rely on the mystique of rarity. It built a doctrine around it. It trained, standardized, positioned, and scaled. From Berlin's vantage point in March 1944, that scaling was itself a signal. The Americans were not treating this as a curiosity for a single regiment. They were integrating it at division and corps levels, embedding trained speakers across infantry and artillery so that the technique survived casualties and kept its breath under fire. If you were hunting for a weak seam in the system, that institutionalization was bad news. Fragile improvisations snap when a single man is lost or a single sheet of paper is captured. Robust programs do not. The Marines' version looked robust. Nor did the Germans deceive themselves with the hope that any single failure would prove a general rule. They had read enough of the war to know that individual messages could be compromised or misunderstood. That radio discipline could decay when fatigue and fear bit. That human beings were insecure systems. What mattered was whether the pattern bent toward vulnerability or toward resilience. The pattern they could infer bent toward resilience. Even if a fragment were captured, a scrap of a code list, a remembered term from an interrogation, the Americans changed their overlays, expanded their lists, retrained their pairs, and sprayed sand in the gears of correlation. The more the Germans thought about it, the more it came to resemble an opponent who refuses to sit still for the photograph you need to build your case. Out of that thinking emerged a set of case studies that, pieced together from the European side of the war's information pipeline, made the assessment concrete. Quailin was the easiest for Berlin to see in early 1944 because its calendar overlapped with their own assessment window. The landing began in late January. By February, early Allied narratives were in circulation, and detailed after-action analyses would follow. The German reader, trained to extract signal from a propaganda-conscious Allied public voice, looked for the bones underneath. In those bones was a picture of artillery and infantry close coordination in a choral environment that punished ambiguity. When the squads pushed along causeways or through wrecked buildings and coconut groves, the difference between smoke landing 40 meters left or 40 meters right was a difference that you could not amortize away. It showed in both. If the Marines' voice system allowed them to call that correction in the time it took a word to leave a mouth and reach a trained ear, then any enemy who required a crypto ritual before the correction could be read was, by definition, late. The German officer writing a March 1944 brief did not need to claim miraculous speeds. He needed only to note the comparative logic. The American method removed steps that an outsider could not shortcut without being inside the linguistic club. In Award, later in February, broadened the dataset. The island group offered the same tactical grammar, small spaces, many sightlines, and a premium on control of fires. Berlin's men were disciplined enough not to pretend they had access to the nets. They had access to the outputs, the pattern of fast American adjustments, and the operational results that followed. From there, a staff mind can write a cautious syllogism. If rapid, accurate correction of fires correlates with improved speed of advances at key points, and if the Americans possess a tool that plausibly delivers that correction faster and with less friction than a classical encipherment chain, then an enemy without the tool is structurally delayed. The syllogism did not claim that success came only from the voice system. It claimed that the system solved a bottleneck in a place where the fight had many bottlenecks. Even an incremental advantage applied to the right bottleneck is a war-winning move in miniature. The Germans knew that lesson from their own practice in other theaters. Seeing it turned against them sharpened their respect. When German officers tried to fictionalize a counterfactual where they did have a recording, the exercise still defeated them on the calendar. Start with a clean intercept from a reliable Japanese forward collection point. Route it to a qualified linguist in Tokyo, then across liaison to Berlin. By the time the recording arrived at a desk with a German linguist ready to work, the scene on the island would have changed. The terminology might have evolved, and the tactical net would be gone. Even if you grant a perfect line of communication and a rare linguist, your reward is a post-mortem comprehension, whose only operational value is to inform the next battle. That is not nothing. Intelligence lives on such lessons. But the specific promise that crypto makes to the commander to give you access to the enemy's will before he imposes it on you evaporates when the time-to meaning slides past the decision. This was the clock that kept ticking in every paragraph of German analysis by March 1944. By the time the Marianas came into Vusapan in June, Tinian and Guam in July, German thought world had already set. Berlin in March could not read a June future, but it could forecast the shape of problems and the shape of its own answers. The forecast said that where the Americans kept pairing their trained speakers with Marine radios at the point of friction, the operational effect would be speed, and that speed would be purchased by the enemy at a price paid in confusion and delay. Months later, Allied narratives would detail the same pattern with names and times. Berlin's earlier assessment had, in essence, predicted that documentary track. That, too, was part of the internal pride of a professional trade. A good analyst is not embarrassed to admit a limit. He is ashamed only if he fails to describe the limit honestly enough that the future recognizes it. When later, Marianas evidence arrived that showed the Marines again using their voice system to keep battalion-level nets clean. Fused and fast, the Germans could point back to the spring pronouncements and say that the logic had been sound. The interplay with Japanese cryptologic practice gave the Germans both humility and confidence. Liaison in war is often a dance of partial truths and national egos. But the March 1944 picture from Berlin includes genuine respect for the technical competence of their partners, and for the simple fact that proximity gives you powers that distance denies. When Japanese analysts, with microphones closer to the fight, refused to promise that comprehension could be achieved on the battlefield in time to matter, the Germans listened. They did not assume that a distant European mathematics would conjure what an experienced Japanese ear could not. They built their judgment on coalition evidence, which is to say, on the best approximation of reality available to them in that month, and then they moved resources accordingly. That resource decision is the quiet center of the German admission. They did not carve the word unbreakable into marble. They diverted personnel away from the problem. In staff practice, that is how the language of unbreakability is written. Because the German archives were already becoming a battlefield of stories by 1944. The men who framed the assessment also rehearsed the counter-arguments they knew would be raised later. One counter-argument said that the problem was merely the language barrier, and that any barrier can be overcome with enough trained people. The rejoinder in March 1944 was not philosophical. It was arithmetic. How many trained people? How many months? How many recordings? How many controlled ground truth correlations? And how many battles will be fought and decided while you build that machine? Another counter-argument said that human systems leak, and that patient exploitation of small leaks accumulates into comprehension. True, responded the March memoranda, but this system leaks in the wrong ways for us. It leaks toward those who are already inside its world, not toward outsiders, and the tactical window slams shut before the leak can be bottled and drunk. A third counter-argument said that the system could be defeated not by comprehension, but by jamming or deception. That, too, found its answer in practice. Jamming was a finite instrument whose employment had to be prioritized against high payoff targets in Europe as the air war intensified. And voice deception requires knowing the voice you are impersonating and the idiom he uses. There are easier false flags to hoist than a Marine's idiomatic Navajo at dawn on a beach 2 oceans away. The Germans also weighed the cultural and ethical oddity of their position. At a desk in Berlin, a man trained in the classic schools of European philology and mathematics confronted a wartime problem, built from a language that his civilization had not cared to learn in times of peace. He needed it now, and did not have it. The reflection did not make it into every memorandum, but in the private spaces between sentences, the irony was not lost. Military institutions inherit their strengths and their blind spots from their societies. In 1944, the blind spot mattered, operationally and symbolically. The Marines program made a virtue of a culture that had been suppressed and marginalized. It fed the battlefield with voices from places far from Washington. The German response, insofar as it existed, could not be built quickly from a standing start. The war does not forgive late curiosity. The experience narrowed to one lesson that the cipher rooms could carry into their other work as spring unfolded. Choose targets whose timelines match your tools. Where a machine or a method can yield in hours, invest. Where the structure of the problem and the geography of the war push your time-tuning into weeks or months, do not pretend otherwise. The belligerent that wastes his best people on targets that cannot pay in time will lose twice. Once in the battle he fails to influence, and again in the battle he cannot fight, because his experts were chained to a vanity. Behind the March 1944 admission lay exactly that act of choosing. Germany had too little of everything but pressure. The Western Front demanded countermeasures against invasion. The Eastern Front demanded every cryptologist who could squeeze advantage out of Soviet habits. The skies above the Reich demanded radar mines. The Navy demanded triage in the Atlantic. The Marines Navajo voice nets, heard dimly through coalition liaison and the long echo of captured documents, demanded something Berlin did not have: time in abundance. The cipher rooms did not invent it. This is what it meant, then, to say in Berlin in March 1944 that the Navajo system was unbreakable. It meant that the machines on the German benches were the wrong shape. It meant that the experts in German uniforms spoke the wrong languages. It meant, most of all, that the clock on the wall of a battlefield is not the clock on the wall of a laboratory. The Marines made their messages depend on the first clock. The Germans could only offer the second. Around that truth, the rest of the war arranged itself in Europe's spring light. The Allied preparations for France. The Luftwaffe's attrition. The long retreat on the Eastern Front, as those tides rose. The cipher rooms held onto the habit that defined their trade at its best precision about what could and could not be done, and they allowed themselves a professional respect for an enemy who had matched means to ends on a level where every second counted. The historical debates that would follow the war would recast the moment in tones that suited audiences and eras. Some would inflate the singularity of the system, as if nothing else mattered in those island fights. Others would demote it to anecdote, as if voice discipline were a decorative flourish on a foregone conclusion. Neither extreme survives contact with the staff logic that Berlin carried in March 1944. The Marines' use of Navajo did not win the war alone. No single tool does. It did, however, remove an entire class of enemy action from the tactical field at crucial points, namely, the adversary's ability to read and react inside the decision loop of a battalion engaged on narrow ground. In all the chart rooms and lecture halls where modern officers study how to compress decision time and expand the enemy's confusion, that removal occupies a sober place. It is what you dream of when you plan, a way to make the enemy's best people irrelevant at the moment when relevance would cost you blood. If you ask what a German officer in March 1944 would have written down as the final reason for this admission, the answer is not grand. It is a sentence that fits on a line and sounds like staff work. We cannot make sense of these messages fast enough to change the outcomes they influence. To a warrior trained in the long reach of European cryptologic triumphs, it was a modest sentence. To a Marine climbing over a seawall on a hot morning, it was large enough to shelter a life. The cipher rooms in Berlin had no poets. They did not need any to say what they meant. The decision was an allocation of hours in a year that did not have enough of them. And when the year ended, it would be plain that the allocation had been correct. The Marines kept their minutes. The Germans spent theirs elsewhere. And in war, as in any craft, the accounts balance in the end. In the months that framed Berlin's March 1944 assessment, the Pacific kept offering examples that rewarded the same conclusion. And the German cipher rooms knew it not because they could hear the nets, but because they could read the shape of American operations and the after-action bones that survived the censor's knife. The central fact never moved. A battalion that could carry meaning from eye to gun in a sentence spoken between trained partners enjoyed a speed the enemy could not match from outside the language. When the Germans traced that speed across the calendar of 1944, they could sketch how it would look on the islands. They could name from their maps, even if they could not touch their radios. They could predict that a Marine division with those pairs embedded would approach the Marianas with the same habits seen in the Gilberts and Marshalls. That those habits would shorten the loop between observation and correction. And that the price an enemy pays for being late is always the same men and ground. Berlin did not mistake speed for magic. They had spent a generation learning that the most dangerous myths in war are the ones that make you lazy. But speed applied to a bottleneck is not a myth. It is a lever. In a beach fight, the bottleneck is often the coordination of fires within a few hundred meters of friendlies. The place where a 10-second delay grows teeth. A code that removes mechanical encipherment and replaces it with a natural spoken shield-rare phonology, controlled lexicon, and disciplined brevity turns time into a weapon. German memoranda in the spring, therefore, kept returning to the same staff diagram: collection paths, processing time, decision time, action. They shaded the boxes, they could not shrink. Geography shaded one. Coalition liaison shaded another. Language shaded the third. You could work the edges: traffic analysis, correlation with enemy movement reports, the occasional stroke of luck with captured paper, but the shaded boxes remained. And when boxes that control the clock refuse to shrink, the responsible staff stops chasing the fantasy that they can be made to do so by cleverness. That sobriety, which may read like resignation from a distance, is what kept German signals work professional, even as the war's perimeter closed around Berlin. You can hear it in the way they graded targets. Across March 1944, the Army's cryptanalytic arm prioritized Soviet systems that still yielded to patience and mathematics. The Luftwaffe pushed its countermeasures where the air war demanded them. Naval signals focused on what was left in the Atlantic that could still be forced. The Marines Navajo nets, glimpsed through Japanese reports, and the long echo of Allied documents, did not meet the threshold for investment. If the enemy sits behind a wall, you cannot scale before the fight is over. You do not spend your last ladders proving the point. You write the limit down, and you move to a door that might open. To a modern ear, the restraint sounds almost too neat, as if history wished to keep its lines clean. But war never is. German analysts were aware of edge cases, and they wrote them down in the same breath with the doctrine. Could a prisoner talk? Possibly, though the probability of catching the exact man with the current overlay, and then catching him again before the overlay changed, lay beyond the horizon of useful planning. Could a paper fragment survive a beach to tell its story? Perhaps, and perhaps it could seed partial comprehension for a future fight. But partial comprehension obtained after the fact is not a weapon for today. It is intelligence's bread and butter for a next time that may never come if today goes badly. The cipher rooms did not glamorize the improbable, and they did not mortgage scarce people to chase it. Behind the calculus lay a human scene that belongs to the story because it explains why the scene never changed. A Marine code talker in 1944 was not an idea. He was a trained partner in a net, part of a chain of men who had been taught to make speech serve violence precisely. He and his partner knew the lexicon that their unit had tuned for that month. Those islands, those tasks. He carried the habit of war in his body. He knew when to speak and when to keep the net clean. He was, in the staff sense, a system, and the system was resilient. You could replace him with another trained man. You could expand his vocabulary. You could harden procedures to limit, leak, and fatigue. From afar, German analysts recognized that resilience in the way the Americans scaled the program. They saw it in the numbers the Allies were willing to publish about the size of Marine divisions and the essay frequency with which those divisions were committed to islands where voice discipline decided yards. No enemy throws good steel at a brittle bridge. The Americans kept driving across this one. When the Marianas opened in June, they did so on a stage that had been set by this logic. Sappen's approach promised every difficulty that makes an army's radios sweat. Disjointed terrain, intervisible positions where friend and foe can be measured in field lengths, and the need to fuse infantry observations with naval and artillery fires without harvesting friendly casualties. From Berlin, the reading was simple. The Americans had a habit for that problem. They would carry the habit in with them. In the weeks that followed, Allied narratives backstopped the prediction. Again, the coordination tightened. Again, the net stayed terse, local, and unforgiving of imprecision. Again, the system's human center did what it had been built to do. Tinian and Guam repeated the lesson with different topographies and the same mathematics. To the Germans, who had written their march line, this was both bitter and satisfying. It is a strange kind of professional comfort to be proven right about a limit that hurts you. The hurt, however, had its boundary. German fortunes in 1944 were decided on other clocks. The invasion of France placed a meter on every desk that did not tick in seconds, but in weeks and months. The Eastern Front, 8 divisions. The defense of the Reich sky burned engineers as fuel. In that world, you win by picking tasks that still obey your tools. German cryptology found enough of those tasks to keep its pride. It recorded what it could not do in the same ledger. The Marine voice nets stayed on the cannot side. The clarity preserved everything else from a slow leak of self-delusion. The leak that wastes men as surely as an enemy does. There was, too, a moral lesson that the cipher rooms did not articulate in their memoranda, because memoranda were not built for that register, but that the historian can write without violating the truth of the time. The Marine system drew strength from lives that the peacetime United States had not consistently honored. The German officers confronted a problem built from the world's diversity at precisely the moment when their own state sought to grind diversity to dust. They were professionals first and ideologues second in those rooms, but they could not be blind. The wall they could not climb had been mortared with a culture their own civilization did not possess. They were seeing, in microcosm, a general law. The wider the set of tools and experiences a society can mobilize for war, the more ways it has to surprise an enemy. The narrow state, even when it is technically excellent, finds itself late to a fight that requires a mind it has trained itself not to have. If there is a single sentence that earns the right to stand as the operational end of the story, it is the one the Germans wrote for themselves in March, and that the Pacific later vindicated. Victory at the point of contact belongs to the side that controls the clock of comprehension. Control the clock, and you dictate who acts inside whose decision loop. Lose the clock, and you watch the enemy redraw your battle faster than you can think. The Marines, with a system that made enemy comprehension depend on a human that the enemy did not possess, took the clock in their hands and kept it there long enough, often enough, in places where seconds matter more than weapons. That is the box you check when you grade a tool in war. Does it control the timeline you must live on? The Marine voice nets did. German cryptology, peerless at slower gears, could not spin itself fast enough to meet them. We can argue, and historians will, about precise contributions in specific fights. We can point to shells that found their target without help, to assaults that broke for reasons as old as courage, to defeats that owed more to logistics or weather than to any net. But those arguments live one level down, one level up, where staff work directs resources and where commanders write rules for how their armies communicate. The conclusion is stable. A tool that shuts out the enemy at the exact scale of decision is a tool you keep. A tool that resists the enemy's standard attack paths and forces him to invent new people instead of new math is a tool you keep. In 1944, the Marines kept it, and the Germans, who were very good at reading the enemy's mind when given time and structure, could not borrow the mind they needed fast enough to matter. So the story returns to Berlin in March, to a room where the air smells of paper and hot equipment, and where men trained to see patterns end the day by erasing one. They do not erase it from ambition, they erase it from the week's plan. The order that follows is quiet. Shift effort to targets that still pay. Except that this one does not. And mark the logic so the record will show that the choice was made for reasons that would look sane even to an enemy. That is how grown institutions admit defeat in the limited sense that matters. The sense that saves them from worse defeats elsewhere. And that is why, when we look back for a moment that admits the unbreakable, we should not expect a single dramatic page. We should expect a line in a schedule, a change in a roster, a path not taken. Those are the atoms of decision. The Pacific proved the chemistry. If we ask finally what this teaches beyond its own decade, the lesson keeps its force. In any field where signals meet time warfare, policing, disaster risk, even high-frequency trade, the party that maps meaning onto a channel, the opponent cannot decode in the moments that matter will define the field. The Marines' answer was to marry a human inheritance to a military need. The Germans' answer was to recognize, with the unsentimental clarity that marks real professionals, that they could not build the missing human in 1944, and that the game, at that scale, was not theirs to win. The broader war would end for reasons larger than this. But within its contour lives a truth the cipher rooms wrote before the world wrote it on them. You cannot steal a voice you do not know, and if you try to learn it after the bullets fly, you will be talking only to history. As we approach the end of our remembrance today, we're grateful you listened to this full story with us, and we're glad our archive has nourished your heart and soul. War stories have probably also marked your family's life in some way, haven't they? Maybe you wore the uniform yourself, or perhaps someone you loved did. Your father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. If so, we'd like to invite you to add another chapter to this record. Share with our community a war story that resonates in your family in the comments below. It could be a family tale, a saved letter, a lesson learned on a flight line, or in a muddy field. Anything you want. Tell us from where and what time are you listening to this message. This contribution helps to grow and keep our community together. We can't let these incredible stories be lost in time. The World War II Archives channel was created to honor and preserve these memories. Finally, if this resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe and perhaps share it with a friend who also recognizes the importance of these tales. Stay tuned so you don't miss the next one of our lost archives yet to come.